One of the things that potentially makes me very unpopular in some rooms is that I'll often argue that technologies are social tools that are created by engineers and technical processes, but they're visited upon people in technology, and there is no market for humanity. There is no market for human rights.
Right. My instinct is that we are in pretty dystopian times already. I'm curious what you both think about that statement. But I feel like when we talk about technology, sometimes we're like, well, it's getting kind of bad, or things are bad, or I'm not sure how the democracy is working, or we're losing track of truth and all of these issues. But I think it's also really important to ground the current state. In Canada, for example, we shouldn't have people who don't have homes. We shouldn't have people who don't have food. We shouldn't have the kind of violence that we have, in many different versions. And so, I suppose to start, do you think that when we talk about the concerns of technology in society, that sometimes we're skipping over societal problems, period, and it's a bit of a problem? Like we're going to solve problems in AI, but we're not really looking at the core problem in our democracy or in our society. I'm just curious from either of you, just as a provocation, what do you say to that?
From my perspective, so I work in Congress, and one of the things that we're looking at from the United States perspective is how we're going to regulate and live alongside artificial intelligence technologies. But in the AI Futures Act, which is really our national priorities around that, our first priority is creating an enabling business environment. So even when you have a framework where the most important thing is economic capture, that sets up a conversation around technology, which is all around gain, it's all around markets, and it's not necessarily all around the people that are going to be using these technologies. And I think one of the things that potentially makes me very unpopular in some rooms is that I'll often argue that technologies are social tools that are created by engineers and technical processes, but they're visited upon people in technology, and there is no market for humanity. There is no market for human rights.
Right.
And so therefore, I am certainly somebody through my work who's looking to shift the framing of that slightly, but then obviously balance that I'm working in the United States context. This is a capitalist system, and I'm going to have to negotiate those norms in order to be successful in my work.
I'm not sure there's as much of a disconnect as you're positioning that as. I mean, I think in economic inequality, social injustice, racial intolerance, those are all structural issues. They're functions of our economy, of our society, of our democratic systems. And those structural dynamics of our society are fundamentally being affected and reshaped by technologies. So I think it's okay to look at them both as part and parcel of the same challenges we're facing, right? One of the structural drivers of our economy and our social interactions and our political interactions are the technologies through which we interact with each other.
But where I would argue slightly, just push back slightly on that, is I would argue certainly through algorithmic decision-making that these structural issues are actually being intensified by techno-socio systems. So yes, they exist, but using an algorithm to decide whether somebody should keep their children or not, I don't know that that's the application.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think just to pull it out a bit more, the reason that I think it's courageous, particularly the work you're doing on what to do about Facebook, for example, with hate speech. I listen to these conversations and I think, we have structural racism, we have, white nationalism is rising in Canada, we have, school systems that haven't adjusted, so we have very structural, deep problems with racism. And I'm sitting there going, like, you're not going to solve that on Facebook.
No, but it might be that the technologies we use exacerbate some of these pre-existing social dynamics.
Absolutely.
And I think that is clearly the case with the design of some of these technologies, right? To the AI point, right?
Yeah.
That the very same facial recognition technology that Amazon is using to track consumer behavior is also being used to track illegal migrants in the United States, right? And
Yep.
like, that is the case where a technology developed inside a certain economic system is being deployed for something entirely different, exacerbating a social
And
dynamic,
also
right?
facilitating their deportation. So it's not just tracking the migrants, it's also then enacting these other political systems that are harming families, child separation.
Of course.
But that's not the fault of technology. That's the application, deployment, and potential need for regulation around that.
Yeah, and I think this is what I'm getting at, is I think, is it not true that if some of those base conditions were addressed, and they're not technical, they're political decisions, they're about funding, they're about providing resources to people, they're not technical, that the negative impacts of technology would be less or would be smaller. See, sometimes I think we're just sort of avoiding the core problem and working on the edge. That's what I'm driving at here. So, yes or no, you know what I mean? What do you think though? Like, do you think, where should we, I just worry as a society, we keep kicking down, Ruha Benjamin called it was that finally someone gave the term to me, a perversion of knowledge. We know what we should be doing to resolve some of these structural issues. We're not doing it, and now we're worrying about Facebook.
But that's also not practical. That's not profitable to think about that. So just going back to the AI Futures Act, the first priority is enabling business, the second priority is privacy, and that's specifically thinking about in context of national security, so it's not even my privacy or your privacy. The third is, oh God, I'm now forgetting the third. I'll get back to the third, but the fourth is bias. And bias of what? Bias of whom? What does that really mean? I'm sorry, the second priority is future of work. And then we go down. So we're looking at, let's get as much cash as we can, then make sure the robots don't take our jobs. Yeah. Then don't, and so you have, the people concern is right at the bottom. And I think, I'm very strangely received in certain rooms where they're like, oh my God, here's the person that's gonna talk about people. Right. And I also have to point out, who do you think makes the technology? Like, the robot's not gonna make the robot. We're gonna need a person at some point. And what's wrong with humans anyway? They're fun.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Right. And so given this human piece and thinking about regulatory options, right? Like, do you feel, or are you seeing signs in your work right now that democracy is up to the task to rein some of these issues in?
No. No. No.
I really appreciate that direct answer.
And I think for me, why I'm seeing no is part of technology is like spooking people and trying to act like people often be like, oh my God, the AI can do this. And I always tell a story. I was on a flight recently, and I had this horrible interaction with a customs person. So I'm tweeting. I'm a big Twitter user, different in person, live online, and I'm tweeting at the airline. And I'm saying I've had this really, really bad interaction, and I'm basically trying to get a response from them, and I do. So then when they resolve my issue, partly my fault, partly their fault, partly just immigration people have God complexes, but that's a different thing. We can talk about it afterwards. I tweet back, and the bot says, please DM me. And then I realized I was not interacting with a human being. I was interacting with a bot that was picking up keywords and looking for retweets. So then I call the airline and say, of all the people that you want to use customer service bots on, I may not be the one. I may not be the one, and this is why. And I use that story because there is this, when we're thinking about democracy, we're often, the first line of communication is not even often a person. There's been some type of machine learning sorting going on. And I thought it was brilliant in the previous panel when you spoke about the role of Facebook in electing people. One of the things that I've been looking at, specifically when we were looking at deep fakes and what it meant to communicate online and what it meant to be online, and saying, well, do we need, in the States, social media blackouts before elections?
Right.
And they all looked at me and they're like, this is why we don't let foreigners into this country, because they're coming with all of these EU ideas. And I was saying, well, we've had Trump now for a minute. How's that working? Maybe maybe we should just speak to our neighbors and think about, and obviously it wasn't taken up. I don't think they're going for it. I haven't made news, but it was this idea of the people that we are online are not the people that we are often offline.
Yeah.
The communities that we are we may be a white supremacist online and really get a lot from being part of that community, but we may not be in our real lives, and that skews your vision. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about the Charleston shooting in the United States with the guy who goes into the church while the African American Bible study. And when they looked at his online behavior, he had gone down this rabbit hole of like white on white crime and other things that don't exist, right? And been terrorized to the point that he assassinated nine people during worship. And I remember Data and Society, the research institute that I'm coming from, some of my colleagues had actually looked at the algorithms that drive advertising and video behavior on YouTube, and found that extremist content was being fed to people that had already seen extremist content, and then kind of making them worse. And this was undermining their ideas of community, their ideas of society. And when we did the racial literacy and technology report, we were speaking to engineers in tech companies in Silicon Valley, and they were saying things to us like, that's not freedom of speech. We have the First Amendment. That's not something that we can mediate in any meaningful way. Right. There's no such thing as racism. And I was like, really? Yeah. Like no such thing? Like never ever heard of before? Oh, I see the problem here. And it's that kind of erasure and depersonalization of society that undermines what are communal projects like democracy, like voting. Yeah, and I think what I'm curious about from both of you, in terms of the government and the big technology companies right now, like I feel, for me, one of the scariest moments last year was when Senator Al Franken was, I want to say interrogating Mark Zuckerberg about election interference, and he was basically saying to him, how did you not know that the Russian, that Russian money was being used to purchase these ads? And I remember watching this, and people were like, yeah, come on, Mark Zuckerberg, how didn't you know? And I remember sitting there going, it's the government that's in charge of the election. Why are we looking to Mark Zuckerberg for election integrity? Like, what is going on? And this is what I mean about the dystopia is that I don't know if the roles are getting a bit overly mixed up here, right? Like if the government's looking to Facebook to have integrity in its elections, I think we're kind of going into the upside down. And so what do you think about that?
This morning I was at another event downtown and just following Jim Balsillie. And I said after, like, it's very rare I get to be the optimist in a panel on conversations about tech and democracy, and like after him, I feel like it. And again, I think this might be the case repeated again. So maybe 2 times in one day, I'll be more optimistic about technology than I usually am. But like, I think it's worth framing this conversation in how we as a society have embedded technologies in our lives for the last 30 years, and how the degree to which governments have stepped back from that process.
But who's the we? When you say we as society, who's the we?
Well, that's a very, very good and big question. What I'm referring to is democratic citizens in democratic countries. We, as a collective, have brought and allowed technology into our lives via a almost entirely unregulated system. And we did so for, I think, some good reasons. We, for a long time, and governments in particular for a long time, saw an alignment between the economic benefits of the digital infrastructure we were building and the democratic uses of that same infrastructure, right? For a long time, we saw both as being aligned with democratic and economic outcomes, positive democratic and economic outcomes. And so we stepped back and allowed the technologies to develop in this largely free market system. And it's only in the last few years that we've started to look at and started to feel and see and be able to capture and hear the negative repercussions and some of the social and economic costs that have come with the adoption of those technologies. And I actually think governments are starting to pay attention to this. I mean, I think the fact that we're having the debates we're having now would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. And governments, I think, are slowly starting to turn attention to this. Now, you asked if our democratic system is capable of engaging in this. Yeah. And I think because we waited so long and we allowed the digital infrastructure to mature to the degree it has and to, frankly, monopolize in a very small number of very powerful global institutions, it's going to be very difficult. But there is some degree of change in the public and democratic discourse around this that I think we're trying to get at here.
I'm curious to get your take, because I think a lot of this, I'm with you, except for the part that there was complicit consent, that people participated when you said it was citizens. Like, I feel as though you need to know what is happening in order to be part of that, to have agency in the decisions. And I would say in the last 20, 30 years, I think a lot more has been done to people than they have had that agency to do with technology. I don't know, what's your feeling?
I largely agree, but I would also say I feel like there was a real cultural movement around the acceptance of technology, of course, and that was very intentional. Like, I remember Sophia Noble, a professor at UCLA, wrote the book Algorithms of Oppression, and it was the first time that I realized that Google wasn't like some nonprofit that was set up to just answer my questions. And I was like, what? Why, I need to go back to the library. That's why I don't know anything. You know, like, yeah. And, but around that, there was the idea, at least in the States, that Google was a great place to work. So you would see them showing up in other news. The people there looked really happy. President Obama was like coding with some kid on the internet. And it really, at least in my world and at where I came into technology through education and as an educator and, kind of running around America and telling Black kids that they should code, it was really this like, oh my God, I actually remember saying, you should really learn to code because maybe you too could be Mark Zuckerberg and you too could be rich and really believing this. And so it wasn't so much that, it wasn't this complicity for me, it was a wholesale acceptance. The first day I showed up at Google, I thought I had made it. I'm Zambian, that's where I was born. What's up to everybody in Zambia? I was like, we have made it, we are in there. We're gonna get free food. And then once there, realizing the power dynamics that were at play and realizing, we were speaking in the green room and I'd never used this language, but realizing the way as a Black woman I was being leveraged and, showing up on like panels, that stuff I didn't know about. Like, do you know about this software? I'd be like, oh, okay, no.
Right.
And also realizing that it was a business. And the role of technology the role of private companies, public companies, are to increase value and increase shareholder value. And I don't think that anybody should criticize them for that. That's really not my position. My position is that there should be a counterweight. There should be a public sector counterweight that centers the public good and the common good, and then it's up to the government of that country to decide how they define that.
And that's what I'm not because I'm pretty optimistic that things could be drastically different, I just don't see government action headed that way, nor investment headed that way. I think that's my concern, is that it feels like everybody's kind of okay with this because most of the harm is being done to people who have other harms being done to them. Like I don't feel that there's a big urge to really resolve in a core way. But
where I would push back on in the American context on that was that the Robert Mueller's report on election interference really sent ripples through Washington. And in fact, in terms of audio-visual manipulation and deep fakes, it was Marco Rubio who was the first person to actually go to the Heritage Foundation and say to very right-wing audience, I never thought that my interests would align with them, but I was like, yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
You know, we shouldn't be doing this. And the idea about it was a national security argument. So when I went in and I was saying these are technologies that are being weaponized against Black women and girls, this is unacceptable, we have to move on that, people were like, oh yeah, that's really sad. And then I was like, and they stole the election. And they were like, oh yeah, no, yeah.
Let's go.
We can't have that. We don't want the Chinese are coming, the Russians are coming. We don't want those things. So I would say that there's an impetus. I would also say that there is the desire for economic capture too. And if that isn't, if that's not included, then any arguments are ineffective. Plus, innovation, I actually love technology. I think innovation and ingenuity is something that should be celebrated. It just shouldn't be at the cost of humanity.
Agreed.
So there's been a real pattern in the governance conversation of these mitigating these social and economic costs on both the platform company side and on the government side, to take individual bad things that usually are identified by journalists or by researchers and get a degree of public currency, and addressing solutions to those specific negative things.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of whack-a-mole thing we've been in. And I mean, Facebook is brilliant at this, right? Like every time there's a bad thing that gets identified, they apologize and do some little tweak to try and reduce the chances of that particular bad thing happening again, right? And that is a very bad sign when that pattern entrenches.
Yeah.
Because the problems we're talking about are structural, and they're embedded in the design of these technologies and in the economic model that really just a small number of companies, we have to be really clear on what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a very particular business model by a very small number of companies. That is the root cause of a lot of what we're talking about here, right?
Yep.
And so I think the sign that governments are beginning to get serious, and when you start to see initiatives that target those structural problems. And I think we're beginning to see that. I mean, even just look at the Democratic primaries right now. Half of the Democratic candidates for president are talking openly about antitrust in the tech sector. 2 years ago, never would that have happened. The German cartel office is talking about regulating privacy as a consumer harm in competition law. That is a major thing. GDPR was a total shift. I mean, it's a 10-year process and it's already out of date, but that is a major change with global implications to how we're all using technology right now, right? So those things that get at the structure, the privacy issues, the competition issues, are the signs we're moving in the right direction here. And I think there are some of those.
Yeah. I think both, in the course of speaking to you both, have raised the idea of utilities as something to think about. Can you riff a bit on that when you think about technology companies and public utility or just utilities?
I think so. Certainly in online search, I can see a legal argument for treating online search as a public utility because it's something that we all have to use all the time. There's actually no way around using Google for online search, for example. On the internet, there is DuckDuckGo. I love you. Don't hate me. But they don't really have the market share. So it's not just the utility conversation. It's married with the antitrust conversation. And then this idea of promoting small businesses. So you would have to build a complete narrative to get the shift and have a raft of principles. And the reason that I like those are, I don't believe in laissez-faire economics. I think the invisible hand crushes poor people, Black people, vulnerable groups, and that's not the type of society that we want to live in. So we do need to have a measure of regulation that protects the most vulnerable, but then frees the more resourced groups in society to go and pursue their will. And I really love this idea of while the top rises, the bottom rises too. And I am actually really optimistic that at least some of those may stick, just because we are now beginning to see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other women like her in the United States context who are social democrats. That's what they're saying, and they're looking to shift other parts of the economy. And so I think that this could be a natural shift. Obviously, Silicon Valley are not going to like these proposals, but I would argue that Silicon Valley are more powerful than the government in some ways. So we need a redistribution of power. No 5 companies, 10 companies, 20 companies should have that amount of power. That just seems ludicrous.
Yeah, well, we were talking earlier about how these companies just aren't rational anymore because money doesn't matter. They can just sort of do whatever.
Yeah.
And drop it, try a product out. If it doesn't work, they can leave it alone and,
Yeah, they can do anything.
Right. And I think that's the part in the monopoly discussion that's not getting addressed, because this is one of the outcomes, is once companies get that big and have that much money, they're just starting to do things that like you say, it's more power than government. And I think
Libra, Facebook just got a currency the other day.
Right.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Right, and this is the thing, it happens, and everybody looks around and says, oh, so they're doing banking now, and then goes back to lunch, right? Like,
the Libra case is a fascinating case of a company that has been in the lowest...
Can you explain what it is quickly?
So...
Ish.
Facebook and a number of other companies have proposed a type of currency that will be backed by an investment fund, that will sort of stabilize the currency and can be used as a means of trading digitally. It's not really a cryptocurrency, it's something a little bit different, but they're basically trying to be a means of exchange for the internet that Facebook can then embed in their products and be the lead on. But I think that tells us something about how they perceive the regulatory threat right now, right? So to be a little more pessimistic about this, the company has never had a worse public image. They are facing the most regulatory pressure and investigative pressure they've ever faced in their history. And they think that now is a good time to launch a global currency that could destabilize the government function of controlling monetary policy in their countries, right? Globally.
Crazy.
So I think we do have to put the regulatory threat in perspective, right? That they think they can still get away with that, or it's still worth, I was going to say get away. They think they can still take the risk of pushing aggressively into a new space that challenges the authority of democratic states.
But then
right? And that is an interesting
But
statement.
I think even with, they're just not living, there are alternative realities. And I just think that we're in a reality that potentially they're not. Because these are also the same people who will have discussions with them. And, I'll say things like existing civil rights law in the US does not allow for racial proxy or, accountability for racial proxy because of intentionality, right? And they'll say things like, well, then we'll get an ethics board. And I'm like, what? Who cares about your ethics board? Get one, get 10. You're still going to get regulated. So there is this, there is this feeling that the language, like the English I'm using, is not reaching their ears. And part of it is just being insulated. I was saying in the green room how Mark Zuckerberg's wife has just bought a school district. Their kid is coming up to school age. So they were like, oh, let's buy a school district. These are not people that share our material circumstances. Like the rest of us are just like, please, can I get into the school, please? I'm going to make cookies. I'm going to make friends with the people. And not these people. And I was really happy that Congresswoman Maxine Waters, she heads the Financial Services Committee, and she's already moved to stop Libra going anywhere. but they had a nice launch party.
Right.
And so you mentioned their financial capacity, but they actually are very much determined by their financial model and their need for profits from the existing financial engine they have. They're a publicly traded private monopoly, right? And who have shareholders, who demand growth, who have directors who are responsible for growth, right? So that's a really strong structural incentive to behave a certain way. And it requires an insane global scale that everything they do needs to be applicable to. In Facebook, it's 500 billion pieces of content a day, right? Like that scale is massive. And so everything they do needs to be thought of in that, from their perspective, in how can this be rolled out globally. So there's latest speech regulations and this idea of a court, like a, whatever they're calling it there, moderation court or council or appeals court. It's going to be 40 people that will be the appeals court for a private entity to mediating speech globally in 4,000 languages.
4,000, right? 40 people, 4,000 languages.
40 people, 4,000 languages, 150 countries, right? So that is an economic model that's determining their need to do that, but it also leads to the exact situation you're talking about, which is a total disconnect between national and local context and the cultural and social dynamics and regulations and policies we put in place over super problematic, but worked through over long periods of time through messy democratic processes are not necessarily embedded in the design of the technologies that are being deployed
globally. And also,
globally.
To your point about this international context, Libra may seem ludicrous in Toronto, right? But in unbanked global south, where they want to capture that market, it may be seen as a liberatory act. It may be seen locally.
You hear the sirens?
Right, exactly. Yeah, call the police immediately. It may be seen as this act. And Google have just opened AI Africa in Accra. And I'm getting all of these emails like, oh, you should come and you should tell us. And I'm like, busy today. Nope. Nope. But they're really like, and I think this is the problem with the 40 people. Which 40, which nations? Are the Global South included in this? Are they aware of the risk? Because we weren't 3 years ago, to your point.
So we've had some discussions about mitigating these issues. Just before we head to questions, do you see any regulatory or policy or legal moves to start building out other structures or other opportunities? Or do you see any, what from a democratic perspective should we be pushing on that's not just mitigating and defense? Like, how do we start getting into what we want the internet to be, what we want it to look like, how we want it to function? Like, do you see any motion there? And it's okay if you don't.
I'm loving my brothers and sisters in San Francisco right now for banning facial recognition technology.
Right.
I think that the surveillance of people in public space, particularly on technologies that are untested, because that's the other part of this. It's often when these technologies are sold and rolled out, it's with the assumption that it works. But if you have a technology that's supposed to see faces but cannot see mine because it's black, that technology does not work, right? And then you're embedding it in automated vehicles that are supposed to stop because they recognize people, and I'm not even recognized as a person by the technology. I don't think that everything needs to be improved. I think we should have the political will and community organizing around what we don't want, so that we can make space for what we do want. We do want greater efficiency, as long as that efficiency isn't at the expense of vulnerable people. I do want to be able to speak to my grandmother in Zambia and share my life with her in a way that I wouldn't have been able to 50 years ago. Those are things that I want, right? And I sometimes get very frustrated when people, it wasn't until San Francisco banned facial recognition that I was seeing op-eds that were like, wow, we can stop technology. Right. We're still in control. Same with listening technologies. We have in New York a technology called ShotSpotter, which the NYPD use to, if there's a shooting incident, they can listen to the audio files. They have microphones all over certain neighborhoods, yes, mine. And if a shot is heard, they can then listen into the conversation around that so that they can try and catch the people.
Right.
And there's some people doing an investigation now that are finding that sometimes they'll just pretend there's a shot because they just want to listen to what people are saying. That should not be allowed.
And I think we dodged that one. Toronto was going to be the first Canadian city that was going to use ShotSpotter, and I believe at this point in time there's been a hold put on.
Well, I think your sidewalk labs people are scaring people off, and we need that too.
Right.
I can't believe we went an hour in a conversation with Bianca and not talking. That was the first sidewalk mentioned.
And questions?
I was going to just transition to sidewalk already because I actually think that is a case where communities and citizens have decided to reframe a debate about technological innovation and the particular individual cool things that are possible with technological innovation and reframed it, as you have led, into a conversation about civic space and democracy.
Right.
And that is a really positive sign, because we're starting to talk about these issues not as individual pieces of technology that have play useful roles in our lives, but we're talking about them as social and political infrastructure. And that is a really positive
And it's a model. I know
Absolutely.
that I know in my work, I certainly invoke your work and the work of, I'm so excited to be, I'm excited to be in Toronto because the Raptors won, and I was like, what a great, what a great time to come to a city. And I was like, I wonder if Drake's going to be here. But also, that is a great example of what potentially could be done by a city, and what can be learned from cities as well. Because I would hate for people to walk away with the impression that I hate it and we shouldn't do it. No, I just want it to be in concert with, like, when we invented the wheel, we didn't run over humans, right? We still needed humans. So some, like, living with, working with is kind of where we're going.
And it's messy.